Okay, so hopefully this is the last video I have to make on this topic because I don't really want to sit here and bag and rag on Destiny 2 anymore. I made my video about my issues with the loot and stuff like that, but I really want to touch upon what I think are the core issues with Destiny 2, and then just kind of leave it at that because honestly I don't really care to dig into this game anymore or even in any way criticize it or praise it until something's changed, because I just don't think Destiny 2 has that lasting impact that Destiny 1 had, and I don't think I'll be sticking around much longer if the game continues to stay this way. So I think my biggest issues, as well as the community in general's biggest issue, is that Destiny 2 lacks that core fun factor that Destiny 1 had. Now let's break it down as to why it's lacking those things. There's a lot of people that can't put their finger on it, but I think we can. We just need to evaluate this and look at what's changed from Destiny 1. It's honestly not that difficult. Think about what Destiny's 3 greatest strengths are as a video game. It's a great social experience, and I don't think that's changed from Destiny 2. In fact, I think that's remained almost perfectly intact. However, that social experience is hurt by the other two things that Destiny 2 lacks that Destiny 1 had. Destiny 1 was a great power fantasy video game. There are a lot of power fantasy games out there. All sorts of RPGs, action games, adventure games, stuff that make you feel super powerful. But Destiny is a game where you are literally playing as an immortal godlike being. You are playing as a superhero of sorts. You have superpowers. That's the entire point of Destiny, and it gives you this intense power fantasy, having these amazing guns that you can just wipe through enemies, and you can at times feel unstoppable. Obviously you can go too far and get yourself killed as a result, but that's where the fun factor from Destiny comes from. And even in PvP, in a sense, although a lot of people want much more of a controlled PvP environment in Destiny, that doesn't really fit the theme of the game. I know that Destiny 1 had a lot of issues, and a lot of the complaints were about how chaotic the game was in PvP, but that, when you think about it, really fits the kind of game that Destiny is. You know, you're dropping 12 immortal gods with superpowers into an arena and having them go at it over and over and over, and then they just keep being revived, and they have nothing to fear. That's what you're doing. You're putting them in that scenario. Why would they not just go all out? Why would they not want to go all out? I don't understand that logic of, no, it needs to be more tempered, you need to play it more safe. That doesn't fit the theme of Destiny as a game. It just doesn't. Not to mention, Destiny is not a mechanical and technical experience. It has way too many shortcomings to ever possibly hope to be that kind of experience, even on the PC version, and let me tell you why. Most mechanical shooters and most really high technical shooters do not have all of the additional effects that really make Destiny what it is. They lack a lot of the particle effects, the bloom, the intense sound effects, the intense visual effects. They give you really good and strong feedback, but they don't have so many things getting in the way of your play like Destiny does. Destiny has way too many other things going on to ever possibly hope to be a mechanical shooter. In fact, talk to most pros of games like Counter-Strike and Overwatch and stuff like that, and most of them will tell you that for the most part, they tend to actually lower the settings on their games when they're playing them, so they have as little clutter in the way as possible when playing their game. Destiny's design, both visually and audibly, is the antithesis of that. It is not supposed to be that at all. Where Destiny's strengths lie are in the satisfaction of a kill that you get. All of the visual and audible feedback that you get from a particular kill that just makes it punchy, that gives you that satisfying feeling of being able to pull something off almost regardless of what your skill level is. It's not about seeing the kill numbers pop up on the screen over and over and over, or seeing your entire name fill the kill feed. It's also just as much about the explosiveness, that bombastic way in which you finish off all of your enemies, and the fact that the entire game practically cheers for you when you make a kill. That's how the game feels, and it's a great feeling. That is something that Bungie has always mastered and has been prevalent in their games since Halo 1. That's not even a Destiny-only thing. That's just Bungie's polish at work, and that's how Destiny's been. And Destiny 2 has those elements, but it's trying to go to war with itself by retaining those elements, and then also trying to suddenly be something more mechanical, something something more of a shooter, which I don't think is correct because Destiny is as much a shooter as it is an action game. It has so many other things at play that are supposed to enhance that power fantasy, and Destiny 2 wants to scale too many of those things back. And I think the biggest reason as to why they want to scale those things back is because Destiny 1 was often criticized for being too easy. But I also think that that's a fallacy because Destiny 1 as a whole was not too easy. There were activities, especially at certain periods, that were incredibly difficult. Think the raids, especially Vault of Glass. Think early versions of Nightfalls and stuff like that, where if all your team members died, you were kicked to orbit and you had to start the entire thing over. Think about things like that and try to tell me that Destiny 1 didn't have its difficult moments, because it absolutely did, despite all of the quote-unquote overpowered abilities and guns at the time. Even in vanilla Destiny, where things were at their most overpowered, you could still find difficulty in areas, but it's not about the gameplay mechanics that are preventing something from being difficult in Destiny. It's more the activity design. It's more the way that Bungie wants to present those activities, and it's clear to us that in Destiny 2, when it comes to most of the menial activities, they still don't want to make them difficult, because Destiny 2 still isn't a hard game. It's still very, very easy, but again, it comes back to the Nightfalls, specifically the Prestige Nightfalls, as well as the Raid, that present that difficulty to us. It actually hasn't changed, so scaling everything back in Destiny 2 has only done one thing, and that has promoted more of a passive playstyle with the player base. It has done nothing to change the way the game plays in any other way, except for to slow the pace down and to make it less exciting. You physically cannot rush headlong into situations in the same way you could in Destiny 1. The game just does not allow for that. And all that does is detract from the fun. That's Destiny 2's biggest issue, is it lacks the fun that Destiny 1 had. But there's another thing that Destiny 2 lacks that I think a lot of players have been pretty vocal about, and I'm going to be vocal about as well. And I kind of touched upon this in my loot video, but I'm going to be a lot more level-headed and a lot more, I suppose, analytical of this problem this time around. And that is the loot, but more so the grind for the loot. And I'm not talking about the grind for power. That's completely different. There's a grind for power and a grind for loot. Grind for power is to watch that arbitrary power level number go all the way up to 305, or in Destiny 1's case, up to 400. That has never really been handled well in Destiny, and I don't even think Destiny 2 makes it any better, because that number's always, for the most part, been pretty darn arbitrary. You don't really need to hit that. I saw a lot of people this week complaining about how, or this last week, complaining about how Iron Banner does not reward you for a certain power level. Well, did you play Destiny 1? Because aside from in year 1, it didn't matter anyway. And even then, you had to be 2 or 3 levels below max level for it to suddenly matter. It never really did. You had to be pretty darn far off for power level to actually matter. And from what I know from most of the hardcore player base, or even the player base that's still playing to this point, most of them are within 10 or 20 power level of each other. It's not really going to make a difference, and it never really has. Even the Prestige Raid and the Prestige Nightfall, you need to be 300 light, which is not the max, or 300 power level, excuse me, I'm still in Destiny 1 terms. You only need to be 300, when 305 is the max. 300 is just as easily attainable from doing normal world activities, such as public events, such as lost sectors, things like that. You only have to do those kinds of things, and you can hit 300 light, no problem. I've brought characters all the way up to 300 without doing a single Trials of the 9 match, Raid, or Nightfall. It's not hard. However, when it comes to the loot grind, that is where Destiny's identity and core endgame comes from. Because that's the reward that we get, and that's where the excitement of getting weapons comes from. Those moments in year 1 where people were looking for that Gallarhorn or that icebreaker or that last word that dropped, and they freaked out, and they posted reaction videos specifically for the Gallarhorn, going and getting to the exotic chest in Vault of Glass, and then getting that Gallarhorn out and freaking out and screaming and getting, a million views on YouTube just for finding the Gallarhorn. Those moments were special. Getting those legendary weapons in year 2 and year 3, I'm thinking of stuff like the Ice Luna or the Matador or the Party Crasher, these things that you wanted to get that absolute perfect god roll for, and having to work hundreds and hundreds of hours. But the difference between working those hundreds of hours and working the hundreds of hours you could potentially do in Destiny 2 is you were still doing something constructive. Even if it was a slow burn, obviously there was a reason people kept doing it. If they wanted something that badly, they would continue to do it. That's how the grind works. Not everybody has to do that, but that's why players would do it. In Destiny 1, hundreds of hours will still only reward you with the same weapons as you were getting in hour 1. There is no difference. But we got to analyze, okay, well, where did they go wrong with this? Because it's not just the fact that rolls are static now. It's also the fact that the perk pool has been shrunk. It's also the fact that there aren't a lot of weapons in the game. And it's also the fact that the mod system isn't very deep. And it's also the fact that weapons only have one intrinsic perk now rather than two like they did in Destiny 1. Or at least for the most part. There were a couple exceptions. But they still had more perk options. Destiny 2 has single, double, triple, quadruple, and quintupled down on the excitement of weapons in Destiny. It has gone way too far. It's like getting an ice cream with all these different toppings on it and then scaling back so far that suddenly you don't even have the ice cream anymore. Like, that's what Destiny 2 is. It's stripped away as much as it can down to the very bare bones, and that's not smart design, I'm gonna say. I don't want to criticize Bungie, I don't want to be mean about this, but I think that that's completely missing the point in the excitement of Destiny, and also completely missing the point as to why players stuck around in those dry periods during Destiny. But I also think we need to take a look at something else when it comes to how Destiny reached this point. And Bungie, if someone ever heard this, they probably won't, but if you do, I think this is the one thing we can learn from this situation going forward from here, because I think this is a problem that has stemmed from the very beginning of Destiny, and that's, I will say that it is a little bit part on the community's end as well, but I also think Bungie themselves could do a good job of reading these complaints and these criticisms and addressing them differently from the way that they have, because from the very first patch in Destiny 1, what did we get? We were getting blanket nerfs for a weapon type. Look at the way auto rifles were handled at the very beginning of Destiny 1. They were blanket nerfed, and they were never the same again from that point on, aside from the very low impact, high rate of fire auto rifles. Never really attained their former glory ever again. And then let's look at something like hand cannons, which were so dominant for all of Year 1. Even in the auto rifle meta, they just came to the very forefront after that auto rifle meta went away. For an entire year, hand cannons were super dominant, especially the 3 exotic hand cannons, the Last Word, Thorn, and Hawkmoon. Very, very dominant all the way up to the end, and then they got nerfed and they never felt quite the same again. And all the criticisms came out. Well, maybe Bungie is nerfing these things wrong, or, you know, this weapon was super overpowered and I'm glad it's gone. You know, I think of Thorn specifically when I think of criticisms like that. But is the problem really that things were overpowered? Now, people are going to immediately go, yes, that's exactly what the problem is. Why are you trying to sugarcoat it? No, but seriously think about it. Was it the fact that something was overpowered, or was it the fact that you were sick of how overpowered it was? What if Thorn had only been that overpowered for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe a month? Rather than, what was it? I think it was almost 5 months that it was that dominant, although 3 months specifically, because that was during the trials period. If it had only been that strong for a month at most, would people still remember it to this day as the most infamous weapon in the game? If rather than having only 8 or 9 metas throughout the entire course of Destiny's life cycle, we had almost 30-something metas, you know, because metas were shifting so frequently, would any one of those metas be to this day? So, I mean, of course there would be some that stand out, but would there be some that the entire community and Bungie as a whole is so afraid of going back to? Probably not. I think a flavor of the month idea, as much as those are often frowned upon and cringed at, would actually be a good idea, because what is the one thing that kills an online and an evolving experience more than anything else? It's not when something's overpowered. That's not usually what it is, because then usually the community has something to rally around when that happens. It's not when content drops that people don't like. It's when nothing happens. It's when stagnation occurs. That is the thing that will always kill an online experience faster than anything else, and that is what resulted in those major dry periods in Destiny. It wasn't just the fact that we weren't getting content, it was the fact that nothing was changing. It was the fact that shot package shotguns ruled the Crucible for an entire year. It was the fact that pulse rifles were strong for so long. It was the fact that Mida multi-tool ruled the Crucible for 8 months, and even after the fact, even at pretty much any period, it was still freaking dominant. It was the fact that sticky grenades were dominant forever. But think about those things. I mean, a lot of those abilities and weapons only became strong because other things got nerfed. If everything had been left intact, I don't think sticky grenades would have ever gotten the complaints that they finally got in year 3, because up to that point they were untouched. They were never touched. There were still people that complained about them, but it wasn't a huge community outcry until they were the last man standing, essentially. And that, again, I think, was more a result of stagnation. It wasn't as much a result of things actually being overpowered. Because here's the thing about overpowered stuff, is it's still fun to use. Overpowered stuff is enjoyable. Overpowered stuff, yes, it might rule the landscape for a little bit, but people have fun during that period until they get sick of it. Let's not let players get sick of things anymore. And I know that this would be asking a lot out of Bungie. You probably need a lot more testers. You'd probably need a lot more people working on how to change things around. But it can be done. Not to touch upon another game that I know a lot of people are unpopular with, but regardless of your opinions on the game, you have to admit that the developers of Overwatch are very on top of their PvP landscape and making sure that that game shifts constantly so it never stagnates, even between events and things like that. No matter what your opinions are on that game, you have to admit that game does a very good job of shifting constantly. I'm not saying Destiny needs to shift that often, but it sure needs to shift a heck of a lot more than it did in Destiny 1. A lot more. Because I think that is really where our problems lie. It's not the fact that abilities and weapons are overpowered. The power fantasy doesn't need to go away. The weapon grind doesn't need to go away for the sake of balance. All those things, balance doesn't need to be in the game. Balance is never perfect. In fact, balance is boring. What we need is constant shifts. What we need is constant changes. The thing is content is always going to get dry a lot faster when that content isn't exciting. No matter how much of that content you push out, people will only burn through it quicker if it isn't as fun. Let's try to make the content fun again. That's all I'm asking Bungie. I'm not saying we need to bring it back to the level that Destiny 1 was at necessarily, but I think we need to start finding a middle ground between where the game is now and where the game was then. There's got to be this midpoint, because yes, I understand that you don't want to make casuals feel left behind. I fully understand that. I feel that way with lots of other games I'm not as hardcore into. But at the same time, you cannot just leave the hardcore player base completely high and dry. You can't not give players something to chase for. And please do not make Destiny 2 a one-and-done experience. Otherwise, it will never have the staying power or the lasting impact of the legacy that Destiny 1 had, despite being a fundamentally worse game at launch than Destiny 2 is.